Dialectology is the formal study of dialects and dialects. It's a branch of linguistics that aims to understand the variations in language across different regions and groups. Now, when we talk about dialect in everyday speech, people often think of it as something negative or rustic, maybe a substandard way of speaking. But from a linguistic perspective, that's not how it's viewed at all. Linguists actually use the term dialect in a neutral way, meaning it's simply a way to describe a particular form of a language used by a specific group. They recognize that everyone uses at least one dialect, even those who speak what we call standard varieties, like the standard English taught in schools or used in formal settings. And here's a key point: no single dialect is considered better or more correct than another. All dialects are structured systems with their own rules and logic. They're equally valid forms of communication. So, in the bigger picture, dialectology helps us appreciate the rich diversity of language and understand that all these different ways of speaking are natural parts of human communication. When we talk about accent, we're referring specifically to the way a speaker pronounces words. It's all about pronunciation, the sounds and intonations that make a speech recognizable as belonging to a particular region or group. Now, an accent is just one aspect of language variation, and it represents a variety that is phonetically or phonologically different from others. On the other hand, dialect is a broader concept. It includes not only pronunciation differences, but also variations in grammar and vocabulary. For example, if you compare the phrases, "I did it" and "I done it," the difference isn't just how they sound, but the grammatical structure. That's a dialectal difference, not merely an accent. So, when we distinguish between accent and dialect, it's important to remember that accent is primarily about pronunciation, while dialect encompasses a whole range of linguistic differences, including grammar and word choice. This distinction helps us better understand the richness and diversity of language, which is central to the overall theme of how language varies across different regions and communities. When we talk about a traditional definition of a language, it's often described as a collection of mutually intelligible dialects. Basically, if speakers of different dialects can understand each other, those dialects are considered part of the same language. However, in practice, this criterion doesn't always hold up. For example, Scandinavian languages like Norwegian, Swedish, and Danish are generally mutually intelligible, but many people still consider them separate languages. On the other hand, some German dialects aren't fully mutually intelligible, yet they're classified as a single language mainly due to political reasons. This highlights that mutual intelligibility isn't a perfect or consistent measure. It's also important to realize that intelligibility isn't just about the words or sounds. It can be influenced by non-linguistic factors too. For instance, a listener's willingness or motivation to understand can significantly affect whether they comprehend a dialect or language. So, when we consider the criterion of mutual intelligibility, it's clear that while it's a useful concept, it's not always a definitive or straightforward way to distinguish languages from dialects, especially given the complex social and political contexts involved. So, this slide discusses a key criterion that linguists have traditionally used to tell the difference between a language and a dialect. Essentially, a language is seen as a collection of dialects that are mutually intelligible. That means that speakers of these different varieties can understand each other easily and communicate without too much trouble. However, even though this idea sounds simple, things get pretty complicated in practice. This is because there are many factors beyond just mutual intelligibility that influence how we classify languages. For example, political and cultural boundaries often play a big role. Let's take the Scandinavian countries, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Speakers of these languages can generally understand each other quite well, but they are still considered three separate languages. Why? Because they each align with different nation-states, each with their own standard languages, literatures, and cultural identities. On the other hand, there's the German case. Some German dialects are not mutually intelligible at all, yet linguists and speakers often consider them all part of a single language because of shared cultural and political ties. So the big takeaway here is that mutual intelligibility is a useful, but not absolute rule. Many other factors, especially political and cultural, also influence how we classify languages versus dialects. This highlights how complex and nuanced this distinction really is, and it connects back to the overall theme of understanding language diversity and classification. Let's talk about degrees of intelligibility. It's not simply a yes or no situation. Understanding can vary in degrees. For example, a Swede might understand a Norwegian quite well, but not as effortlessly as they would understand a fellow Swede. To make communication smoother in such cases, speakers often make allowances, like speaking more slowly or avoiding tricky local pronunciations. Now, moving on to non-reciprocal intelligibility. This is an interesting point. Understanding isn't always mutual. For instance, Danes tend to understand Norwegians better than Norwegians understand Danes. This difference can come from linguistic factors, or because Norwegian pronunciation often sounds like Danish spelling, making it a bit easier for Danes to interpret. So, when we think about mutual intelligibility, it's important to recognize these nuances. That understanding can be asymmetric and influenced by various linguistic and social factors. Let's explore the concept of the willingness to understand. Interestingly, whether someone can understand a language isn't just about the words or sounds. It's also heavily influenced by social and psychological factors. For example, a listener's exposure to the language, their education level, and even their willingness or motivation to understand play crucial roles. Now, this brings us to a fascinating case of social resistance. In Africa, a powerful ethnic group once claimed they understood the language of a smaller group. They did this to justify taking over their territory, arguing that they were the same people. But the smaller group disagreed. They claimed not to understand the language of the dominant group as a form of resistance, basically refusing to accept the narrative of sameness and asserting their own identity. Moving on to another interesting idea, chains of intelligibility. In rural areas, dialects often form a kind of geographical continuum. Imagine two neighboring villages, Village A and Village B. The people there understand each other perfectly because their dialects are very similar. But as you move further away, say to Village Z, small linguistic differences start to add up. Over distances, these differences become so significant that people from Village A and Village Z can no longer understand each other, even though there's a chain of mutual understanding connecting all these villages. This complexity shows us that language isn't just about the words or grammar. It's deeply embedded in social, political, and cultural contexts. That's why many linguists argue that language is more than just a linguistic system. It's a social construct shaped by human interaction and identity. When we talk about the term language, it's important to recognize that it's often seen as a political or historical concept rather than just a purely linguistic one. This means that what we consider a language can be heavily influenced by social and political factors. Linguists, on the other hand, tend to prefer the term variety because it's a more neutral way to refer to different forms of speech. Instead of labeling something as a language, we think of it as a variety, simply a different way that language can be used or spoken. Now, within this framework, we have the concepts of autonomy and heteronomy. Autonomy refers to a variety that stands completely on its own, independent of any standard or norm. Heteronomy, however, describes a variety that depends on a standard norm, like Dutch dialects that look up to Standard Dutch as their model. Interestingly, heteronymous varieties can gain more independence over time, especially through political change. For example, Afrikaans and Norwegian are cases where varieties were once dependent on a standard, but eventually became recognized as independent languages due to political shifts. This highlights an important point. Language is not just a linguistic system, but also a social and political phenomenon. Our understanding of what counts as a language or dialect often hinges on these social and political contexts, which shape how languages evolve and are recognized. In rural areas, dialects often don't have clear-cut boundaries. Instead, they tend to merge gradually, creating what we call a geographical continuum. This means that linguistic differences build up gradually as you move from one place to another. For example, if you're in an area where villages are close together, people can usually understand each other quite well. But if you go to the far ends of this continuum, the dialects might be so different that mutual understanding becomes difficult. Some major examples of these continua include the West Romance continuum, which spans from Portugal all the way to Italy, and the West Germanic continuum, stretching from Germany to the Netherlands. These are vast regions where languages gradually change across space, blurring the lines between what we might traditionally call separate languages. It's also important to note that deciding exactly where one language ends and another begins on these continua is often quite arbitrary. Sometimes, political or cultural factors influence these boundaries more than linguistic differences. So, the idea of strict borders between languages doesn't really fit with how language variation actually works across large geographical areas. This concept of a geographical dialect continuum helps us understand the fluid nature of language and how it evolves and spreads across space. Continua can also exist across social scales rather than just geography, which is an important point to consider. In Jamaica, for example, there's a continuum that ranges from what we call pure, standard English at the top, down to the deepest Jamaican Creole at the bottom. Most speakers don't stay fixed in one spot on this continuum. Instead, they slide up and down depending on the social context or how formal the situation is. This fluidity can create educational challenges. Children who speak intermediate varieties, somewhere in between, are often taught in a standard variety that feels semi-foreign to them. It's like trying to fit a language or dialect into a box that doesn't quite match how they naturally speak. This social dialect continuum highlights how language is deeply connected to social identity and context, which ties back to our overall theme of understanding language variation and its implications. Systematic dialect study started in the late 19th century, driven by the neo-grammarians' bold claim that sound changes are exceptionless, meaning they happen in a regular and predictable way. To test this idea, dialectologists began collecting regional linguistic data, hoping to see patterns emerge. However, early on, the results were quite mixed. Instead of clear patterns, they found a lot of heterogeneity, quite a bit of variation that seemed almost random. This unexpected diversity caused a period of skepticism, where dialectology and broader linguistic theory remained quite separate, almost isolated from each other. But the field didn't stay stagnant. It was eventually revitalized, thanks to technological advances like improved recording methods and data analysis tools. Additionally, the integration of sociolinguistic theory helped us understand how social factors influence dialect variation. So, the history of dialect geography reflects this ongoing journey: initial aspirations, unexpected complexities, and eventual reinvigoration through new methods and ideas, all contributing to our overall understanding of language variation across regions. Let's talk about how traditional dialect geography often selected a specific type of informant called the norm. Now, norm is an acronym that stands for non-mobile, older, rural, male. These individuals were chosen because researchers believed they represented the most conservative speakers, essentially capturing speech patterns from a bygone era. They were thought to reflect a time when speech was less influenced by urban mobility and modern changes. While this approach was effective for documenting traditional regionalisms and dialect features, it's important to recognize its limitations. By focusing only on norms, we neglected the mobile, urban majority of the population, whose speech might be quite different. So, in essence, choosing norm informants gave us valuable insights into historical speech patterns, but it also meant missing out on the diversity of contemporary language use across different social groups. Until recently, dialectology largely neglected towns and cities. This was because many philologists considered urban areas to be impure when it came to language, mainly due to migration and social flux. They thought that the constant movement and mixing of people made urban dialects less stable and less interesting to study. However, modern urban dialectology has changed that perspective. Now, researchers use random sampling methods to make sure the speakers they study truly represent the entire population of a city or town. This shift allows us to get a more accurate picture of how language varies across different urban environments. One of the key focuses now is on social stratification, looking at how language differs depending on social class, age, or ethnic group within the same place. This helps us understand that dialects aren't just regional, they are also social phenomena. In essence, today's approach recognizes that every dialect has both regional and social dimensions. This broader view enriches our understanding of language variation, especially in the complex social fabric of urban areas. It's an important shift that connects to the overall theme of how language changes and adapts in different social contexts. So, on this slide, I want to highlight that many studies aim to observe informal or casual speech. This type of speech tends to be more systematic than the formal varieties we often encounter. However, there's a challenge called the observer's paradox. Essentially, when a researcher or a tape recorder is present, people's speech naturally becomes more formal. It's like they're aware of being observed, which influences how they speak. To get around this, researchers like William Labov developed clever techniques. For example, they might ask informants to talk about life-threatening experiences. These topics tend to evoke more genuine and relaxed speech because they're emotionally engaging and divert attention from the fact that they're being studied. The goal here is to let the speaker's natural vernacular come through, rather than speech that's overly prepared or formal. So, the key point is that understanding and mitigating the observer's paradox is crucial if we want to capture authentic, casual language in our research. It's all about designing methods that help the speaker forget they're being studied, so their natural way of speaking can be observed. This concept ties directly into the overall theme of understanding how language functions in real, everyday communication. Let's explore how linguistic variables are closely tied to social class. Generally, as you move down the social scale, you'll notice an increase in the use of non-standard language variants. This means that people from lower social classes are more likely to use these non-standard forms in everyday speech. However, when we're in formal situations, like reading word lists or during official presentations, most social groups tend to shift toward using standard forms. This shows that regardless of social background, there's an awareness of appropriate language use depending on the context. Now, a particularly interesting phenomenon is hypercorrection. Lower middle-class speakers, for example, often go beyond the higher social classes in their use of prestige forms when they're aware they're being monitored formally. They do this because they want to sound more refined or correct, but it can sometimes indicate a kind of linguistic insecurity, like they're unsure if they're using the right language and are overcompensating. All of these behaviors highlight how social class influences stylistic choices in language. They remind us that language isn't just about communication. It's also a signal of social identity and status. Understanding these patterns helps us see how language reflects and reinforces social structures. Let's look at some interesting patterns in language use across Western societies. A consistent finding is that women tend to use fewer low-status forms compared to men. This trend appears across almost all social classes, with women generally scoring higher on the use of prestigious, standard variants of language. Now, there's this idea of covert prestige, which is quite fascinating. Men are often influenced by non-standard speech that they associate with qualities like masculinity or toughness. So, in some contexts, non-standard language can actually serve as a way for men to signal their social identity. On the other hand, women may use language strategically to signal social status. Historically, women have had fewer opportunities for achievement in other areas, so language becomes a way to assert their social position. This discussion ties into the broader theme of sex and gender differentiation in language. It shows that how we speak isn't just about communication. It's also about social identity, status, and cultural expectations. Let's talk about isoglosses, These are lines drawn on a map that mark the boundary between two regions where a specific linguistic feature differs. Think of them as the borders that separate different ways people speak in neighboring areas. When multiple isoglosses happen to meet in the same region, they form what's called a bundle. This bundle is significant because it indicates a major dialect division. For example, a well-known bundle separates the langue dial of northern France from the langue d'oc of the south. What's really interesting is that these isoglosses often align with cultural boundaries. That means they can correspond with differences in legal systems, agricultural practices like crop rotation, or even the architecture of houses. Mapping these boundaries, these isoglosses and bundles, helps us understand how language, culture, and regional identity are interconnected across different areas. While an isogloss might suggest a clear-cut boundary between dialects, in reality, speech tends to change more gradually. Transition zones are these areas where variability is quite common, and speakers often use a mix of different dialect features. Sometimes, you'll find what we call fudged lex. These are speakers who adopt a pronunciation that's kind of a halfway point between two dialects. These zones demonstrate that isoglosses are actually simplified, abstract lines that don't fully capture the true complexity of how people speak. So, in essence, language change and variation happen along a spectrum, not at sharp boundaries. This helps us understand that dialects are more fluid than the neat lines we often imagine. To study change without having to wait for decades, researchers often use what's called the apparent time hypothesis. Essentially, this method involves comparing the speech of different age groups at a single point in time. The key assumption here is that adult speech tends to stay relatively stable over a person's lifetime. So, when we see differences between, say, 20-year-olds and 70-year-olds today, those differences can give us clues about how language is changing over time. It's important to distinguish this from age-graded changes, which are patterns that recur as individuals grow older. In other words, some speech features change naturally as people age, but these aren't necessarily indicative of language change in the broader community. Instead, what we're focusing on with the apparent time hypothesis are those differences that reflect actual language change happening across generations. This approach helps us understand linguistic change in a practical way, without needing to wait years or even decades for real-time data. It's a powerful tool for studying how language evolves in society. Linguistic innovations tend to follow what we call an S-curve model. This means they usually start off slowly, then they accelerate rapidly as they gain momentum, and finally they slow down again as they approach full adoption or completion. It's a pattern we see quite often in how new ideas or technologies spread. Now, when we look at how these changes spread geographically, there's an interesting pattern called diffusion down the urban hierarchy. Essentially, innovations often jump from large cities to smaller towns, skipping over rural areas entirely. These bigger urban centers act as hubs of influence, and the diffusion radiates outward from them. To understand and predict this kind of diffusion, we can use a gravity model. Think of it like Newton's law of gravity, but for cities, predicting the influence one city has on another based on their populations and the distance between them. Larger cities exert more influence, especially when they are closer. So, connecting this to the overall theme, understanding these patterns helps us see how innovations spread not just over time, but across space. It also highlights the importance of major urban centers in shaping cultural and technological change throughout regions. Modern dialectology is really a blend of three main streams. First, we have traditional dialect geography, which focuses on mapping regional language features. Then, there's urban sociolinguistics, which looks at how language varies within cities and communities. And finally, human geography, which considers the broader spatial and social contexts that influence language use. Over time, the field has shifted from simply documenting static regional differences to understanding how language varies dynamically within communities. This evolution allows us to see language not just as fixed regions, but as constantly changing and adapting. By recognizing variability as a fundamental structural unit, Dialectology has become an integral part of broader linguistic theory. It's no longer just about mapping dialects, but about understanding the underlying processes that create language variation. This unified approach really helps us better understand the complex system of human linguistic knowledge. It also highlights how language is deeply embedded within social contexts, which is essential for grasping the full picture of how we communicate and evolve as a society. Thank you so much for your attention today. I truly appreciate your time and engagement throughout this presentation. Remember, the main takeaway is the importance of understanding and implementing these key concepts to drive success. I hope you found the information valuable and that it inspires you to take action. If you have any questions or want to discuss further, please feel free to reach out. Once again, thank you for being here and for your commitment to growth and improvement.